it can't be America alone trying to press China, just as Europe needed to choose between deterrence of Russia and economic opportunity and dependence on Russia. They're going to have to recognize that China is part of that same condominium. And if they're serious about trying to get Russia to stop, they're going to have to join the United States and others in pressing Beijing to pull back from that material assistance. And if we don't do that, I fear that we're in for a long grinding process where Putin will not get serious about peace.
Hello and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I'm Kartlo Sharashanidze, and today I'm joined by Steve Yates from the Heritage Foundation to discuss US-China strategic competition. Steve brings extensive experience from his time on National Security Council and his current work on China policy. Discussion will cover bilateral tensions, regional dynamics, Ukraine, Taiwan, global partnerships, and Cold War concepts. Mr. Yates, first of all, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. Let me start with your general observation of US-China relations, like considering the statement made by President Trump last week that China, along with Russia and North Korea, is conspiring against the United States. So what is the present situation?
Well, for decades, our global leaders have been talking about the interplay between China, Russia, and the United States. Comes from the Cold War times through to today. And in recent decade or so, that has changed fundamentally because there was pretty significant controversy surrounding Russia that was dominating American international and domestic media coverage and politics. And of course, that in the midst of all of that, there was the tragic reinvasion of Ukraine that kept the focus on that area. China, through that period, where the perceptions were changing as a result of unfair trade, military modernization and aggression towards neighbors, the COVID pandemic and the consequences of that, fentanyl controversy that's hit many, many American families, including my own, and a whole host of other issues. It sort of was changing perceptions of China in that it wasn't until a year or so into the Russian second invasion of Ukraine that the question of how much was Beijing really helping the Russian war machine keep going began to get much attention. At first, it was sort of denied. And then it became sort of accepted wisdom, but some questions about how or what could be done about it. But in the middle of all that, you also have organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where China has tried to be a leader or center of gravity among a lot of former Soviet republics. And then there's the BRICS gathering that talks about being an alternative structure in the world that is explicitly countering the American or Western institutions that had dominated the Cold War and post-Cold War period. So all of that is sort of what has colored things. But that statement that President Trump made was most interesting because he has been very open about willingness to meet with and talk to and negotiate with Putin, with Xi Jinping of China, and with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, with an aim of trying to de-escalate tensions, trying to stop hostilities or avoid hostilities, and to try to find a more stable balancing point. That's the theory that was behind thought be in the transition and coming into government. But the president, as you no doubt have noted, has gotten a bit frustrated with Moscow in particular, and he's sort of just beginning to prepare to have a more in-depth summit with Xi Jinping in coming weeks or months.
Right. Recently, it has been reported that President Trump could have a meeting with President Xi next month. So what do you see as the main goals the U.S. should have from this possible meeting? And how does President Trump's approach to China in the second term differ from his first term approach?
Well, in some ways, he has always believed in having leader to leader dialogue and negotiations. And in doing so, he usually will say flattering words about the quality of his relationship with his counterpart. He will do things sometimes to shock the information environment, to try to make people unsettled and sort of read where things are moving, to try to pick targets for his negotiated deals. And the difference this time around is he has the experience of the first term, and that hasn't dissuaded him from the imperative in his mind to have direct talks and negotiations. But there, he has the experience of having negotiated a phase one trade agreement that didn't get implemented. He has the experience of President Xi not telling him the truth about the COVID pandemic, and there were dire consequences to that. He had the promise of cooperation to halt the flow of fentanyl precursor chemicals. And those, of course, exploded during the Biden years. And they've come down some with border enforcement in the United States, but still much more needs to be done. So he has the experience of negotiating before. And as he did with Vladimir Putin, he felt like he had good rapport and thought he had good understanding with his counterpart. But now, perhaps, as has been the case with Putin, he has to assess, am I really getting the action that the conversation led me to expect? And with Putin, he's expressed public dissatisfaction with the actions versus words. With Xi Jinping, we're at an earlier phase of that conversation in the second term. There is an Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit that will be hosted in Korea, in the southern part of South Korea, in late October. It would be a natural place for a bilateral meeting to occur with China. The president's held out the possibility of going to China before or after that. He's also, when the South Korean president was in the Oval Office, held out the possibility that the South Korean leader might join him on the plane to visit with Kim Jong-un in North Korea or fly with him to China for the conversation. So those are the unconventional things that can come up when Donald Trump is talking about this, but those have been all put on the map as possibilities.
So, what are your expectations if those meetings take place? You mentioned that President Trump has extensive experience with those leaders from his the first term. But what has changed for those leaders over the past few years, like the 4 years? Are they now in a better position, and how should the U.S. adopt to this reality?
Well, that's a good question. There are some big fundamentals that have changed between the first term and the second term that don't have to do with American politics. They have to do with changes in the world. And of course, Russia's protracted war is a significant change. When Trump was in office before, we were not at a period of armed conflict. Of course, the United States is not directly in that current conflict, but has been very directly in the policy and negotiations related to the conflict. And so the whole environment around the relationship with Russia is very different in 2025 than it was in, say, 2017 when he came into his first term. With China, it's different in the sense that Xi Jinping is a later term leader. There's still front and center this question of unfair trade practices that President Trump has made a priority throughout, and his desire to negotiate a more balanced, more fair deal. That's continuity. But the changes, China's been very aggressive toward its neighbors. It has encroached upon the Philippines in ways that are quite surprising for long-term Asia watchers. Its military exercises that encroach upon Taiwan are much more frequent, much larger scale, and much more provocative than things that occurred in the Biden term and in Trump's first term. And so there's an escalated sense of tension in both of those relationships. And so the big question for President Trump in trying to have talks with Xi Jinping is there's a pretty wide range of very big issues where China really needs to move and the president needs to get China to move. And that, top of the list for me is fentanyl. How do you justify letting chemicals into the world illicitly that are the number one cause of death for 18 to 35-year-old Americans? That's just an unfathomable problem, and China must stop that. And how does the president get that to stop? But he has to talk trade. And he has to talk about China's role in the Russian war machine and how to change that. And he's threatened secondary sanctions on China. And if you threaten them, you have to back them up and do it, or they become empty. So those are the hard things on the president's ledger. Now, his leverage with China is the United States remains the biggest, most robust consumer economy on the planet. And China cannot survive healthily without reliable access to it. So the president does have some leverage and some cards.
You mentioned Ukraine several times. From your perspective, what are like the China's strategic interests in Russia's war against Ukraine, and what does this mean for Washington's policy toward China? Like, what does the U.S. need to do in this situation regarding Ukraine?
Right. Well, I do think that the president needs the Chinese to believe that secondary sanctions will apply to them, or I don't believe they will change their strategic behavior. And their strategic behavior at the beginning of the war on Ukraine was one of China sort of playing all sides. They were everyone's friend, and mostly they wanted to profit when the conflict was over. Ukraine has natural endowments that are of value to China and wanted to preserve access there. And there was a relationship with Russia that they wanted to preserve. So they were sort of playing all sides. As this has gone on, I can't speak to what Ukrainian perceptions are of China's role, but China has become much more involved in supplying energy and material to Russia that undeniably sustains that war effort. And so that gets in the way of whatever pressure sanctions might have on Russia. It also means that the president needs Europe to make a choice, that it can't be America alone trying to press China, just as Europe needed to choose between deterrence of Russia and economic opportunity and dependence on Russia, they're going to have to recognize that China is part of that same condominium. And if they're serious about trying to get Russia to stop, they're going to have to join the United States and others in pressing Beijing to pull back from that material assistance. And if we don't do that, I fear that we're in for a long grinding process where Putin will not get serious about peace.
So Europe has a major role in this administration's approach to Ukraine, right? So you mentioned tariffs, and now we are seeing President Trump expect the EU to impose tariffs on China as well. So we are also seeing agreement where NATO and EU countries are paying for U.S. weapons for Ukraine. So what are your expectations? Like, is Europe ready to take on those responsibilities to help the situation?
Well, just from my point of view, I just speak in terms of Europe, whether it is a coalition of individual countries, whether it is through the European Union as a formality, whether it's under the guise of NATO. To me, I am ambivalent about which of these gatherings are the cooperation partner that provides the material assistance and buys the material assistance. The core principle is that it should be Europeans doing all they can to help other Europeans first, so that America can play a supporting role in that, not taking anything away from the need, but America has to do things in other theaters that Europe cannot have a decisive impact on. And so in order to balance those risks and responsibilities, I think that's where the principle of Europeans doing more for themselves and for other Europeans has to apply. And I think there has been progress in that area. And so I'm relatively optimistic that the right things can be done there. The connection to Europe's dealings with China is one where it's not as if Europe is vital for success as much as failure to support guarantees the ineffectualness of whatever the United States would try to put by way of pressure on China. It's sort of like what has happened with Iran-related sanctions over the years when the US and Europe were unified in trying to have pressure on the Iranian regime against their nuclear program and against proliferation. But Russia and China were doing business with Iran that made those sanctions and that isolation less effective. And so Europe, we need them not to be a net negative in trying to put pressure on Beijing to change its approach with Moscow with regard to the invasion of Ukraine. Uh, we don't have high odds of success in this, I would say, because China and Moscow operate under their own logic. They may think that they're insulated from sanctions, but I think it's a must try, and I would like to believe that like-minded democracies could be unified in making that work.
All right, so many experts say that what happens in Ukraine like sets an example for China regarding Taiwan. So what does this mean from the US perspective for American strategy toward China?
Yeah. Well, I do have friends who speak in those terms of drawing parallels between the Russia-Ukraine situation and China-Taiwan situation. I don't subscribe to that point of view, in part because I see a very separate logic in each of those. The one is an active conflict, the other is a conflict we hope to avoid. There are some lessons from the Ukraine experience that I think very correctly apply to the way Taiwan and its friends should be thinking. Everything from the failure of deterrence prior to the second invasion and to the learning lessons from drone warfare to cyber and other capabilities. I think that we have learned that there is a different form of warfare at play and that we need to have a different form of deterrence, perhaps, if we're going to keep China from trying to do to Taiwan what Russia did to Ukraine. But the problem from the East Asian point of view is that China has sought to impose its will on Taiwan long before there was a question of whatever Russia's relationship was with Ukraine. And I don't think that the Communist Party of China would be dissuaded from that long-term way of thinking, regardless of the direction the conflict between Russia and Ukraine would go. I still think it's important that we do the right things to do the most we can to stop the killing and try to preserve some sense of peace and progress with the Ukraine situation. But I don't think success in Ukraine guarantees success in Taiwan, and I don't think failure in Ukraine guarantees failure on Taiwan. So I don't know if that's too convoluted, but I do know that people in Taiwan follow the situation in Ukraine quite closely, and they feel a sense of common cause. I just, as an analytical matter, I don't see one determinative for the other.
Right. Let me ask you about China's bilateral relations with more than 100 countries, like including EU and NATO member states, right? So those take like different forms. Like we have like comprehensive strategic partnerships, general partnerships, or simply like friendly relations without formal partnership, right? So many of those ties have developed over decades. How do you see the future of those partnerships between Western countries and China?
Well, U.S.-China relations are definitely going through a fundamental transition into what's still somewhat to be determined, but the general direction seems clear. With Europe, it's, I think, earlier in accepting some new realities and trying to find a new path. I think the old way of conducting relations would have sort of a slogan that defines what your aspirational goals are, emphasis on cooperation and friendship. But not all of Europe is affected the same way by dealings with China as other parts of Europe are. When it comes to electric vehicles, that has a dramatically negative effect on some parts of Europe, while it has a net opportunity for the remainder of the continent. The COVID pandemic affected countries differently. Northern Italy was pounded in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. I think people are just slowly coming to the realization that relations with China are not as simple as they thought they were. And that should have been obvious all along. But I think a lot of people in the West, some Americans included, had an overly optimistic and naive view of what interaction with the Communist Party in China would mean, that the Cold War ended, but a Communist Party remains, and there's elements of that Cold War thinking that China tells people to avoid, but it explains what they do. And so we're struggling to assess the new reality and adjust to the new reality. I see individual countries in Europe adjusting in some ways positively to this. In other words, recognizing the realities. I see NATO as making progress, but still more room to go. I see the bureaucracy in the EU a little less clear about how to make this adjustment, whether it's in trade or security terms. But I'd like to believe, whether it's economically with the dumping of products into Europe that's a threat to economic security, or China's very open sustaining of the Russian war machine, might alter some of the calculus for the rest of Europe. And if it does, Europe unified around this, I think could help the United States maybe compel better outcomes from China that avoid conflict and are better for everybody.
Right. So when it comes to strategic partnerships with China, all three South Caucasus countries now have such partnerships with China, right? So Georgia's strategic partnership with the US now is suspended, but back in 2023, when Georgia became a strategic partner of China, it was like the strategic partner of the US, right? So China also has a comprehensive strategic partnership with Azerbaijan, and just recently Armenia became a strategic partner of China as well. So how do you see this trend? Like looking ahead, do you think it will be like the possible for those countries to maintain close ties with like both the United States and China at the same time, or will there be a conflict of interest?
It's a good question. I don't believe it is possible in the long term until there's a change in the way China conducts its interactions. So on the surface, it can look very friendly. And in a transactional way, they can bring economic opportunity. I think, though, the right response by the United States and a lot of European partners, and maybe even some East Asian partners, is for us in a coordinated way to bring economic opportunity to those countries and regions, to give them an alternative to choose. Because I think the quality of the cooperation they could have with Japan, Korea, UK, maybe Germany, France, others, or Poland, together with the United States, that's a bigger, broader, more sustainable opportunity that they probably would welcome. But in the absence of the United States and others doing that, they're saying yes to the proposition China makes. Maybe they like it, maybe that's what they want, or maybe they feel like that's just the best opportunity that's being put before them, so they're accepting it. That's why I think it's imperative for us to find some sustainable peace in the Ukraine situation, for our leadership to be able to focus in these other areas too, to try to bring opportunity. I know that for President Trump, the Abraham Accords defined this alternative path to peace and prosperity. I think that logic explains how he thinks about a lot of other regions too. And if he had more time and more attention that he could give to pursuing alternative paths to peace and prosperity in these other regions you noted, I think he would be inclined to try. And he has envoys that would be active in going out to map out those opportunities. And so I think that is where we need to go. I don't think that it will be in cooperation with those who seek to place priority on strategic partnership with China, but I don't think that has to be anti-China. I think it should just be pro-opportunity with the models, the investment, the information technology networks that we have as being better alternatives. That's the hopeful path.
So I'd like to ask you about China's strategy. I mean, after Georgia signed its strategic partnership agreement with China, Georgian government officials said, we have partnership with the US, but we don't get like visa-free travel or free trade agreements. With China, they said we actually get those benefits. So the question is, how does China use these kinds of tactics? And how central is this approach to China's broader strategy in winning over like the countries like those in the South Caucasus?
Well, the Chinese government does its homework. I can't criticize them for that. And in their homework, they will find areas where some of our partners around the world are unhappy about us not offering certain opportunities or are being distracted by other areas of the world and they might feel neglected. And the China leadership can be opportunistic. I can't blame them for seeking opportunity when we might be distracted or are not in the position to offer what is being sought at the moment. But what I can blame them for is, say, like with their Belt and Road Initiative, where they'll go out and they'll spend what seems like big money, but after it's spent, it's gone. And if it doesn't lead to sustained employment in the target country, and there's questions of corruption or quality issues with construction that come later, it helps the government that's in power, but the government that comes after that suffers, and so do the people. And so I think there's a track record where opportunistic governments might choose the China option, but then they're burned over time, and people need to learn their own lessons on that front. So China does use, the deception could be too strong a word, but they're selling their offer, and it might not be the whole story. And it's more of a short-term transaction, not a long-term commitment. And so I think that's where the United States, if it can get free of the high pressure priorities that are taking so much time, would love to find ways to pursue those kinds of opportunities with some of these areas where we'd have to confess do get somewhat neglected when effort is going elsewhere.
So this is my very last question, Mr. Yates. You mentioned multiple times a new Cold War, right? So this is something we see discussed a lot regarding the current situation, right? So what are the main components of China's strategy in this so-called new Cold War?
The Heritage Foundation did put out a product that defined a comprehensive challenge that we called a second Cold War. Not everyone accepts the way we talk about it, but I would defend the way it was talked about in the following way. I think that the government of China has engaged in Cold War-like behavior for quite a long time. And that just means that during the Cold War, there was a comprehensive competition. There was massive efforts to take advantage at our expense on both sides. And with China, there are increasing signs of that. And that the challenge is more comprehensive than in traditional foreign policy terms. We have our social fabric in our country challenged by economic hollowing out, but also by chemical and biological warfare, whether it's COVID or fentanyl. We have competition for alliances and partnerships that are being challenged and weakened. And there's this an effort to try to undermine what the United States is trying to do that is consistent with a Cold War competition that hopefully stays cold and doesn't lead to a hot conflict. That's the construct that's being talked about. And I think the more people look at it, they'd say, oh, it probably does as they say, look like a duck, walk like a duck, it probably is a duck. And so it looks like a Cold War, seems like a Cold War. If you don't want it to be one, then what are you doing to contribute to an alternative? And that's where I think President Trump and Xi Jinping have their work cut out, primarily for Xi Jinping to say how China seeks a better path with the United States and its neighbors.
Well, thank you so much again, Mr. Yates. It was a great honor to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take good care.